probably doesn't mean anything to any of you unless it was your birthday. We should have had headlines in this country in every paper saying 85% of U.S. House selected, elected, and 65% of U.S. Senate elected, because that was the day of the last party primaries in this country. And on that day, all those positions had been filled because 85% of U.S. House seats are safe for one party or the other, meaning that if it's a safe Republican seat, you know whoever won the Republican primary is guaranteed to win the general. And if it's a safe Democratic seat, well, then whoever wins that Democratic primary is guaranteed to win the general. And this happens months before most voters even show up in November. That is, terribly undemocratic, but it goes even deeper than that. Not only were all those seats chosen, only 8% of voters in this country participated in the elections that chose the majority of our U.S. House and Senate. And then those voters coming in November, that means the majority of us that show up in November are essentially participating in a farce. We're wasting our time, and the system has created it that way. So what I mean by all voters over some voters is that we need to make sure that no winners are chosen until November voters show up. And I'll make one more point about that, if I may. As undemocratic as it is that 8% of people are choosing the majority of the House and Senate, an even bigger problem is is not who wins those elections, it's what then those winners can do. So when winners are chosen in this primary and this primary by this small number of voters, when they get to DC or to your state legislature, which is a similar situation, there are only certain things they can afford to do. They can only afford to take the actions that make these voters and these voters happy. And while most of us would assume that there is virtually nothing in common here and here, there actually is one commonality that's widely consequential. These two sets of voters are characterized by a more extreme ideology and something that political scientists call negative partisanship, which means they want the other side to fail. They hate the other side even more than they are attracted to their own party's platform and policies. So when people are elected by these small sets of voters who are then their bosses, they can't afford to actually legislate, because what would it take to legislate? You'd have to be able to reach across the aisle, discuss, look for consensus, innovate, negotiate, make a deal, and then vote yes. But in our current system, that's a path to lose your job. If we turn it to November, that's a path to keep your job.
Now, before we bring Sybil into the conversation, I want to ask a follow-up to that, because you are, I'm not going to even say a leader, the leader when it comes to a Final Five concept in the general election, whether we want to call it generally ranked choice voting, instant runoff. There's different language for this. How will that in and of itself, changing the system to a more open primary, Arizona has a sort of open primary, but not really, and then moving to an instant runoff, a Final Five, how does that change some of the things you're talking about? Does it increase turnout? Does it change the conversation?
Great. So if we've just talked about the problem, and the problem being that most November voters have no say in who wins, but more importantly in what winners do, then if what we want to do is re-empower, re-enfranchise all November voters in order that those who win can do the job of legislating, the way we need to do that is by changing the rules of how we elect people, which are just made up. Okay, our Constitution fits in the pocket, right? And then underneath that, we make up all these rules. Sybil and I were just talking about how party primaries were made up only 100 years ago. We choose the rules of how we elect people, and that drives the incentives. So Final Five voting is an umbrella term for the combination of two changes to how we elect people to Congress, state legislature, governor. The first change is we eliminate party primaries. We let the parties figure out their own primary process. They're private organizations. They can figure out who they want to nominate any way they want. Instead, we have, for the public, an open preliminary round on the same date as you had your primary. All the candidates run on one ballot, regardless of party, and we all vote on that same ballot, regardless of party. Pick your favorite, polls close, count the votes, and out of this single preliminary round, the top 5 finishers will advance to the general election, which is to say, we won't know who's won when only 8% of people were participating. So that's the first thing. So now the decision's going to be made in November. We're going to benefit from dynamic, diverse competition between that preliminary round and the November date, so we get to know these candidates and we have a lot of diversity to choose from. And then in November, now that we have 5, it's great we have that competition, but we wouldn't want one of those voters to one of those candidates to accidentally win with 21% of the vote if the vote split relatively equally 5 ways, right? We need to find out who has majority support. So we simply use instant runoffs to narrow the 5 to the final 2, and then it's clear who has the majority. Instant runoffs are exactly like a series of physical runoffs, but instead of having to keep coming back for another election when you go from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2, voters simply cast all their votes at once on election day using a ranked ballot. I like them first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice. And that way we will always elect the candidate with the greatest appeal to the most number of voters. Last thing, Steve, Sybil, thank you for your patience, is that out of this, you will elect someone in the general electorate with a majority. Theoretically, that's going to be the best winner, you could say. But the most important thing about Final 5 voting is not changing who wins elections, it's changing what those winners can do when they get into office. So when someone's elected in this way, they have a lot of agency and power to work creatively and innovatively and powerfully on behalf of Arizona in the U.S. Congress, because they can be deal makers if that's what's good for the state and the country. They're not prisoners of a small slice of voters needing to basically turn everything down and go with gridlock and grandstanding.
Sybil, I have one specific question for you coming out of Katherine, but before that, I want to give a plug to the Center for the Future of Arizona's Arizona Voters Agenda, because I think that wraps in well. Can you give us a brief explainer as to what that is and how it came about?
Sure. Thank you so much. And it is really great to be back in person, and I'll wave to the folks on the other side of the Zoom call this morning. But it's fantastic to be with you, and I just want to congratulate Morning Scoop for their wonderful service to the community in bringing these great conversations to the community. But what I'd like to, I think the role that we can play at the Center for the Future of Arizona is point to some really interesting, important data about who we are as Arizonans. We've heard a lot about polarization and division, not only in Arizona, but nationally. But the question is that really who we are? And that really animates our work at the Center for the Future of Arizona, and has for a long time. We really base our work and our agenda on what matters most to Arizonans. And so we discovered some really interesting things when we first started partnering with the Gallup organization about 12 years ago. We really didn't know what we would find when we conducted this massive statewide in-depth survey. And one of the first things we noticed was that we actually agree on much more than we disagree on the most important issues. We used to joke that there's much more agreement between Phoenicians and Tucsonians than you might imagine, given the rivalries between. So we've really focused on where we can come together as Arizonans and how we can build a positive agenda. And I think the data that we have really contribute to this conversation heavily. So what we did was we created a concept called the Arizona We Want, and 7 shared public values around these major issues like education, jobs, healthcare, the environment, et cetera. So when the last election came about, we thought, why don't we dig in a little bit more precisely? The Arizona We Want was a really very long-term agenda for the state, and we thought, well, there's an election coming up. Why don't we really dig in a little bit more precisely on what is it that Arizonans want to hear candidates for office discussing? And we were thrilled to partner with High Ground Public Affairs on this project, and we created something called the Arizona Voters Agenda. And so we asked about the major issues facing that really grew out of the Gallup survey: education, jobs, healthcare, immigration, environmental issues, elections. And we asked, what would you like candidates for office to discuss? And so this is how the Arizona Voters Agenda came about, and you can find it on our website, but this is what our brochure looks like. And I'm happy to talk more about the details, but that was the basis of the Arizona Voters Agenda.
Let me start off with one specific, and I want to see if you can tell us about what did the Arizona Voters Agenda indicate about likely voters wanting actual positions and solutions from candidates. I think this goes to some extent to what Katherine was talking about, and I'm putting words in your mouth, Katherine, about changing the narrative of how campaigns are run, because you have to appeal to a broader audience. What did the Arizona Voters Agenda say about, maybe a loaded question, but what did they say about that?
Well, we found tremendous agreement on the things that of most importance to Arizona voters. So despite polarized political dialogue, we found substantial agreement on issues such as immigration. Arizonans, by about 84 or 86%, want immigration reform with a pathway to citizenship. We realize that's mostly a federal issue. They agreed on many issues around the economy, education, water and the environment, housing affordability, and election processes. On education, for example, very large support for increasing funding for education. But this is an interesting way to highlight the gap between not only what candidates were talking about, but what elected leaders are delivering. If you think about the last 20 years, most increases in education funding have come through ballot initiative. Now, when I first moved to Arizona 20 years ago, I'm embarrassed to say that I voted no on every single ballot initiative. I've said, this is the weirdest way to conduct legislation. Why isn't the legislature doing its job? And then I quickly realized that this is how we do things in Arizona, because we need to go to the people. And in education funding, I think one can demonstrate a fairly large gap between what Arizonans want relative to education funding and the battle it is in the legislature. So that's an interesting example of this gap that we find between what Arizonans want and what we're getting.
And can I
Please,
comment on
please.
that? It's very interesting that what you do in Arizona is go to the people through this ballot initiative. Another way to go to the people that will influence every decision every day that the legislators are making is to actually have the legislators elected by all the people in November. And then that will be what's impacting their decision. You'll still have the option for ballot initiative, but maybe you won't have to use it to the same degree. And it's very expensive, because they'll be in there looking at a consensus way forward on your complex problems.
Yeah, I think, just a quick comment, I think I implied this, but an interesting way to look at ballot initiatives is a symptom of the problem that you're talking about.
Katherine, one of the things that's interesting to me is we have an independent redistricting commission in Arizona, which in some ways can counter gerrymandering, for example, the way that things are set up to have these sort of slam dunk things we're talking about, especially when it comes to House seats and state legislative seats. How could changing to a more open primary, to have an instant runoff in the general, how could that affect the people who are frankly running for these seats? Not the number of them, but the kinds of people running for seats. Will we get people who are going into this, yes, they want to win, obviously, but also because they want to get certain ideas out that aren't getting a lot of discussion? Arizona, obviously, we have great water concerns here, and we think back 40 years ago, that was a bipartisan effort. It's going to have to be a bipartisan effort again, but it's much more kicking and screaming, pulling and dragging because of the people involved.
Yes, so when you change the rules of a game, let's put it this way, like in any human endeavor, the rules of the game affect the way the game is played and the outcomes of that game and the kind of people who want to play that game, the talent you attract. This happens in, the Super Bowl. It happens in Monopoly. I mean, the rules of the game affect. If you use free parking, it's a different game. that didn't work for you guys, but it's very funny in my family because we have to fight about it every Christmas, whether we're going to do free parking. Okay, so the point is when we change the rules of the game in the elections to having this single preliminary round where 5 people are going to advance, you lower the barriers to entry for new competition, meaning that to get into the top 5, you may be able to get there. I mean, you're guaranteed a spot in the top 5 if you get 20% of the vote, right? So if 100% of the people divide their vote 5 ways, 20% guarantees you a spot in the general. But mostly you'll have incumbents, more well-known candidates, more well-funded candidates. So the last 2 people, the 4th and 5th candidates, may be able to get in oftentimes with under 10% of the vote. That is not phenomenally expensive to work your district to get that number of voters to turn out to give you a chance to make your case. And let's see what happens when someone gets to make their case. So Alaska is the first state that adopted an earlier version of Final 5 voting. It's exactly like what I described, but it's Final 4 voting. The top 4 candidates advance to the general election. In their first election under this system, they had a House seat special election in August because their longtime congressperson had died. And it's one representative for the full state, so everybody voted across the state. They had 28 candidates run in this single preliminary round. And the 4th place candidate had 9% of the vote, and the 5th place candidate had 4% of the vote. And they would have both advanced under Final 5, but in any case, in this situation, the 4th place candidate advanced to the general. She was little known, and she was a Democrat in what people think of as a red state, and she went from 9% to winning the general election. Because that's what happens when you lower these barriers to entry and you make it possible for people to present a case that usually just can't make it through our existing system, and therefore people won't fund them, they won't support them because they don't think they have a chance. It's kind of like a vicious cycle of we can't hear new voices. And she made the case and she won, and then they had a rematch again in November and she won again. So we'll see different kinds of people win, because right now, I'm sure you guys talk to your friends sometimes, and maybe it's one of you. I bet there's someone in this room who thinks you'd like to run, but you don't want to do and say the kinds of things you have to do and say to win in politics today, right? You don't want to say things you don't believe in to make it through this primary or this primary, but you know you'd have to. So we will open this, the process to more candidates, and more talent will want to participate in a system that's more conducive to substantive dialogue, and also that when they get there, they can do their jobs. I'm actually not so critical of everybody who's there now. Don't we do what it takes to keep our jobs? So asking politicians to constantly do the right thing when we're essentially saying, do the right thing and lose your job, is not a smart way to do it. We have to make it that doing the right thing keeps their job. So they would finally be there, could be all the same people, and they would be under the system, not hurt by it, but their agency would be so improved they could do the jobs they want to do. They want to serve, they want to solve problems, they want to do Arizona proud. And that's what this does.
So, Sybil, I'm going to turn to you on sort of the education component of this, because Katherine, though, as both of you said, okay, this particular primary system hasn't been around forever and things can change. But Sybil, how much does that put on voters to be more educated if a system does change? Did anything in the Arizona voters' agenda indicate that voters want to dig in more on these issues themselves, or they just want candidates who are going to dig in on the issues?
That's a really interesting question. My feeling, based on our results, is that voters know what they care about. I'll give you an interesting example. We had overwhelming results when it came to concern around water. Now, it is true that we're finally having the conversation about water, but did we hear about it during the election campaign? Not at all, essentially. So I think Arizona voters are actually much more aware of the things that matter and that matter to them and that need to be discussed, and that there's this disconnect between what they care about and what we're hearing on the campaign trail or through our elected leaders.
Can you talk a little more about the disconnect and some of the results you saw that indicated, you said that we were surprised that people in Phoenix and Tucson get along, but when it comes to the specific issues, are there things that voters would like lawmakers to really work on that they're not? You mentioned water. Are there others?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to be looking at my Arizona voters agenda so I get
Yes.
the statistics.
It's good to be clear on facts.
On facts, yes,
Yeah.
facts are
Good.
very important, yes, yes. Well,
Pro facts.
Yes, I already mentioned education, but, Arizona voters by 89% want to ensure that Arizona schools have quality teachers and principals, and they want to expand career and technical education opportunity. They believe that closing achievement gaps among our students is important to ensuring the state can produce the skilled workers that we want. They believe that we need a functioning border. They care more about that than building a wall. They believe that they prefer investing funds in education rather than getting a tax cut. I think those were two very interesting results. They certainly want to secure Arizona's water future, and 95% of Arizonans are afraid that we're going to be running out of water. They believe in our election system. I don't know if you'd like me to
Yes,
get into
please. Yes,
that
yes,
right
yes.
now, but I think this was one of the most noted findings of our survey, because I think there's this narrative that somehow people don't trust our election system, and that the 2020 election and now the 22 election was stolen. But we have close to 80% of Arizonans who believe that our elections are fair, secure, and accurate. And that's a really important number to keep in mind, and I think the recent election probably demonstrated that. At least that's what a lot of commentators are saying. So those are just a few examples of the kinds of things that Arizonans agreed on. Now, to make it onto the agenda, we had to have 50% support among all Arizona likely voters, but we also required that there be 50% agreement from Republicans, Democrats, and independents. This would eliminate topics that, let's say, got 90% support from one party and only 10% from the other. So we were very strict. We figured 50% is what it takes to win an election or win on a topic, so that's what we required. But here's some things that didn't make it onto the voters' agenda that we heard a lot about during the last campaign. Banning the teaching of critical race theory, reducing income taxes, eliminating mail-in voting, changing the law to require those who vote by mail to provide their driver's license, and completing the wall on the border between the United States and Mexico. Those things did not make it onto the Arizona voters' agenda, so they did not make it to that 50% cutoff that we required.
And I want to bring something up here because, again, it goes to what you and I were talking about, which is we think things are a certain way. We're like fish who can't see the water, right? Because we're just in the water. And we're this way about our elections. The fact is that it often doesn't take 50% to win our elections in this country. Almost every state allows for elections with a plurality vote, which is to say you have the most votes, but you don't have over 50%. So when we talk about that the most winners are chosen in the primaries, and here I've used that 8% number nationwide, but let me make it local for Arizona. In the races here that were decided in primaries, it's approximately 17% of voters who were participating in the primary that determined those winners. Okay, you had 35% participation overall, but if you were participating in the Democratic primary in that district, your vote was immaterial, right? Because it was going to be won by a Republican or vice versa. So you have 17% of voters participating. If you have 4 candidates in that election, like I just met Bo Lane, and he was in the Secretary of State race in the Republican primary, and there were 4 people. When the vote divides, someone can win with a small number of votes. We often have winners out of contested primaries winning with 30%. So think of it this way. nationwide, often someone is winning a primary that has 8% participation, and they're getting 30% of the vote of that 8%, which means that 70% of the people in that primary didn't even want them, okay, wanted someone else. We need choice in the general election, and we need the winner to require a majority, both things that don't exist in our current system. And I'd like to just really look at this gentleman here who has, you have an accountability, what is that message on your shirt? Hold politicians accountable. How do we hold them accountable? It's by having other people to choose from. Right now, you can't hold them accountable if it's a lesser of two evils election in a red district or a blue district. You have to take whoever's there. With this, if it's a red district, you could usually have 3 people to choose from, 4 people to choose from who are Republicans, and then 1 Democrat or independents, Greens, Libertarians in the general. And then you can hold incumbents accountable, because even though they have all those advantages of incumbency, they will have, in all likelihood, very legitimate challengers who share their ideology of the same party, but may be offering a different take on it, different skills, different way of working to the general electorate, and then they'll choose. Accountability is driven by competition. There's no accountability in our current system because we have all these lesser of two evils elections.
I love the use of competition there, Katherine. Let's talk about that a little bit more, because you're a businesswoman and entrepreneur, and there's been discussion, I think because of what happened in Alaska, that, oh, this is somehow good for Democrats and not good for Republicans. But if we think about competition, presumably that's going to be good for everyone, including unaffiliated voters. What's the appeal point there to say, listen, this isn't just about anointing one candidate because of the way the district is drawn. This is about building up competition, not just of people, but of ideas.
Yes, competition of ideas. We've been fighting over the same things for 20 years and not solving any of it, because if we solve, even though there's agreement behind closed doors on many issues, many complex issues, those agreements on immigration or debt deficit would require trade-offs from each side, right? Which is neither side would get everything that they told their primary voters, they believe in. So even though you have all that agreement on immigration here in Arizona, the Democrat, can't vote yes on something. Well, you know what? I'm better at the debt deficit example. Let me just switch. So on debt deficit, even though there was agreement on Simpson-Bowles that we'd have to have some increase in taxes and some decrease in entitlements and services, in government spending, the Democrat can't vote yes on anything that decreases benefits by $1, and the Republican can't vote yes on anything that increases spending by $1. Whereas once you have this competition and general election voters decide, they would be able to vote yes on this kind of consensus solution. Now, getting to the overall competition, the benefit of the competition is to create what competition creates in any human endeavor: innovation, results, and this accountability that we're talking about. So it's not just that more is better, it's that more will change what they do. In Alaska, for example, Mary Peltola is the representative that I referred to before. She went from 9% in the primary and won the general, 2 times. She is a Democrat, and that was shocking to people, and that's partly why people are now saying this is a, Trojan horse for Democrats. It isn't. Let's look at a few things. I'll ask you guys, because you have microphones. How much percentage of Alaskans, how many are Republicans in this red state? Anybody know?
2/3.
2/3?
Half.
Half? Okay. 24% of
We're gonna
Alaskans.
edit out what I said then.
Yeah, right. 24% of Alaskans are Republicans. Why do we call it a red state? and 13% are Democrats. So it's red if you only have two choices. But over 60% of Alaskans are unaffiliated, and they, in many ways, haven't had a voice. So now, Mary Peltola, the Democrat, was elected by more Republican and independent votes than Democratic votes. There's no statistical way that that wasn't the case. So how does she govern? She governs for Alaskans. Mary Peltola has retained a good number of the staff, including her chief of staff, of the previous Republican representative who had been there for 50 years. So she's a Democrat, and the Republican chief of staff in her office is still there because she wants to serve Alaskans. She's new to, to Washington, D.C., and she kept the experts because that's what's good for all Alaskans whom she actually represents. Mary Peltola just hired one of her Republican competitors in her election to head the Home Office, I don't know what you call that, where they take the Constituent Services Office in Alaska for Alaskans, because he is a person who knows Alaskans. And so she works with him. And to her, these were all natural things that you would do when you're serving all Alaskans. And she can do those. And by the way, she must do those kinds of things because she doesn't just answer to Democrats. She answers to everybody. Now, she's clear. She's totally, for example, pro-choice. And she makes that clear. And probably her, maybe if a Republican had won, they would have taken a different position. But she's also doing lots of things that respond to that entire group.
I'd love to comment on kind of how we view our elected leaders and what that might help us understand about this system. So, I mentioned that Arizonans are confident in the mechanics of our election. And nearly 80% believe that they're fair, secure, and accurate. But their outlook on elected officials is somewhat different on our elected leaders. So from our Gallup survey, only 10% of Arizonans rate elected leaders as very good. Only 37% believe they focus on the long term. 33% believe elected leaders represent diverse voices. And only 26% believe they work across the aisle. Now, when we first got this information, I kind of dismissed it. This is from research that we've done in the last few years. I just thought, well, it's a national pastime, isn't it, to just kind of hate political leaders? But I have to say that I'm a little embarrassed that that's kind of how I saw it, because if you actually look at what Arizonans say is important to them and what we're getting, it starts making a lot more sense. I worked as a congressional aide decades ago in Washington, D.C. I worked in the White House for 5 years in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. I believe in public service. I have loved it. I've been a defender. Now, this was some decades ago before things got quite as partisan. So I'm not one to want to stand up and criticize elected leaders, and I agree with you. They're doing what they need to do their job. But let me share with you what Arizona likely voters told us with our High Ground survey that they want from their elected leaders. Nearly 2/3 of voters from our High Ground survey prefer leaders who are willing to compromise and work across the aisle to get things done. And nearly 2/3 of voters say the top factor in electing a leader to office is their position on the issues and whether they have clear solutions to issues. To your point about the outlook we have, even I, who have been following our data and really steeped in it every day, I keep saying to myself, is that really true? Because that's not the behavior that we're getting from our leaders. But this is what Arizonans say they want, and I guess it begs the question, is that really what we're getting?
So I keep wanting our national pollsters to start polling differently. Instead of saying Republicans think this and Democrats think this, they should say Republican primary voters think this, Democratic primary voters think this, Republican general election voters, which still includes all the primary voters, and should. I mean, I primary vote. I'm sure you guys do. We're not anti-primary voter. We're just pro-general election voters. So, and then the general election voters who identify as Republican think this, and general election voters, Democrat, think this, and the overall general election voter thinks this. And we will discover that everything we see is responding to those slices, and even how we've been polling it as if all Republicans are the same, it just completely distorts what we as citizens want, at the same time as it pretty much completely controls what our representatives are allowed to give us by essentially the rules of their job. And I don't know how much time we have left, but I want to say something, because I'm looking at leaders in this room, and I know that Arizona Capital Times with this morning's group attracts leaders listening, and regular citizen leaders too. Everybody matters in this conversation. What I want to say is making all voters matter is an extraordinary competitive advantage for the states that embrace this first. Do you want to have the best functioning state government in this country? Get yourself people who can bring their full set of talents, who are not hemmed in by rules that are constraining the creative power of the Arizona citizenry and elected officials. You will start to solve your problems. It is going to take massive innovation to solve water. You've got to unleash the power of your citizens and your electeds to do this hard work. And your federal delegation will go to Washington, D.C., empowered to be some of the deal makers, the negotiators, the people who are on the bench in the Senate, off of whom can come the gang of 6, the gang of 4, the gang of 8, because they won't be prisoners of their party. This actually does say people over party, to say that title was still good. They can be, Arizonans' needs first in Washington, D.C., and be the deal makers. It's a competitive advantage for all Arizonans and your state.
I have to ask a question about party loyalty, though, because that is a real thing. And as you're saying, you're not trying to strip power from a person who wants to be a Republican or a Democrat, but there are people who, because of generations of their families, they've decided they're a Republican. And you mentioned the term Trojan horse before. I'm not sure it applies here, but maybe it does in the sense of, are you trying to make everyone unaffiliated? Are you trying to do these things in the sense that, what if someone wants to stay a Republican, but does the primary system, does changing to a more open primary system, not even talking about stripping the power of the parties, does it strip the idea, what about if someone says, well, I just want to be a Democrat. Why are you trying to take away the influence of this party that I've loved? How does that jive with the argument?
Okay, you guys, I am so pro-party.
Political
People
party.
are, yes,
Yeah.
people are, and parties
other
in general,
parties, yeah.
yes, and parties. We could try to, juice it up here with low mimosa, but no, look, people are busy. We need parties to bring people together to engage in citizenry, to figure out ways forward consistent with people's views and values and ideologies. What we can't do, so I say often, I can't wait until I can affiliate with a party that I fully believe in. I can't wait until I can care and take sides on partisan issues now. I don't take any sides because none of it's going to matter anyway unless we do the system. So I don't want just a mass of unaffiliateds. I think we should have vibrant political parties, they should be part of the civic fabric, and people should be super engaged in them, but not in the way that their primary role is to engender and increase hatred of the other side, which is what's happening when we have these two, and that's what the election rules are incenting them to do. In the way that I want them to be strong in a way that connects their strength with solving problems. So right now, parties get strong by dividing. when we change the election rules, parties can be strong by winning elections with a majority of general election voters and solving those problems. So there's nothing, look, nobody says that having weak companies gets innovation done in Silicon Valley or anywhere, right? You need strong companies, but those strong companies always have to be under the threat of new competitors that keep them accountable, because if they were strong and there could never be any new competitors coming in, they'd just raise prices all the way, right? It wouldn't balance out the power. So parties are great. I'm fine with two parties, but we have, although I think more parties are great too, we have to have the threat of new parties coming in to change the behavior of whoever is there or to take over if they continue to deliver such poor results, which is evidenced by the fact that 90% of people are dissatisfied with Congress. In any other industry, you would have new entrants in there.
Sybil, I thought one of the fascinating things about the voters' agenda is that it was broken down to some extent by, as you mentioned, parties having to have over 50%, or it wasn't just thrown in of 90% of Democrats and 10% of Republicans. How significant do you think it is to make sure that, I don't want to say party labels, but to actually have that play into what Arizona voters may want, or if there is reform possibility?
Well, I certainly agree with Katherine about the importance of parties. I think parties are really important organizing entities in terms of organizing coherent interests in the electorate. You know, as far as the Arizona voters' agenda is concerned, we wanted to make sure that we weren't just taking an average of all voters, of all likely voters, because, as I said, that would mean that in some instances we would have something on the Arizona voters' agenda that was had very lopsided support relative to which party affiliated.
Yeah, that was
with.
brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah, so we didn't want to be open to criticism that, you know, we were somehow favoring, you know, an issue that was not really a consensus issue among the voters.
Another thing I think was interesting about the voters' agenda is this idea that voters did have faith in the system as a whole. They believed that votes were counted correctly and accurately, but maybe they'd want, potentially, as we've talked about with Katherine, maybe they want reforms in other ways, but not in terms of the way that the actual structural stuff is put together.
Well, I would say they, I don't have the, let me see if I can find the exact language. I mean, I think Arizonans believe in that our election system is very sound. It doesn't mean that they don't think it could possibly improve. We didn't, you know, get into details about that. But yes, overall there was strong faith in the fairness, security, and accuracy of our election system.
Katherine, why is this the time for reform? Obviously, you were involved in Nevada, which won the first round. We'll see the second round coming up in 2024, obviously.
Another ballot initiative
Yes.
state that passed Final Five voting in November.
So for a lot of people, it feels like because we are even more hyper-partisan, certainly over the last 5 to 10 years, is that part of why this is a good time, or is there some other reason?
So the best time would have been 50 years ago, okay? But that passed us by. So the best time is as soon as we can absolutely, you know, as soon as we can possibly get it done. Why I think it's, you know, why is it a more likely time than 50 years ago is because things have gotten so bad that we see it in our disillusionment with what people, one area of agreement across parties is, you know, that they don't think things are going well. So we see it with our disillusionment, and we see it in the crises that we seem to be increasingly unable to meet on both a national level and perhaps here in Arizona as evidenced by the looming water crisis and not much, you know, I can't opine exactly on the issue, but maybe you need to be doing much more on that. So, and the other thing is that reformers across the country have been working on these things for quite a long time. Like, I'm new to this party. So we have been trying gerrymandering reform. We've been trying, you know, people have been trying campaign finance reform. We've tried top 2 primaries. We've tried ranked choice voting on its own in some states. You know, so now we really have figured out collectively over time, I think there's really a broadening consensus that all voters over some voters, which requires the combination of a single preliminary round, 5 candidates advancing, and instant runoff general, that's the system that's at the root cause. And now that that consensus is widening every time we get the message out, people are coming together. Here's the last thing is in Nevada, even though that Democrat had won in Alaska, the parties were united against this. Okay, so Final Five voting is already united. They were both opposed to that ballot initiative. But we had supporters who were on opposite sides of the candidate issues in Nevada, supporting one Senate candidate over the other, but on the same side for Final Five voting. We can come together.
I wasn't sure if we were getting the sign that we're going to be.
No, we've got some time left.
Okay, great. Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah,
Oh, sorry.
I'm clearly not in
Sorry.
radio. I didn't
Yeah,
know
right.
what that meant either.
So did you want to continue now?
Yeah, go ahead,
Oh.
sorry.
God, wasn't sure,
Oh,
felt you were getting
gosh,
cut off.
okay, no,
yeah.
time for others anyway.
Okay.
Yes.
Sybil, go ahead.
Well, I thought we were wrapping up, so I was going to give a little bit of a wrap-up kind
No,
of statement.
no,
Okay.
there's much more to come. Come on.
Much more to come. Well, I'll go ahead and say what I was going to say. I think the way we come to the table as the Center for the Future of Arizona is we are committed to bringing the voice of Arizonans to leaders like you and across the state. And so we have committed for many years now to really deeply understand what Arizonans care about. And we did not we are a nonpartisan organization. We did not enter this endeavor with a plan to engage in any kind of political debate or activity. But I will say this, which is it has become glaringly clear that we need to ask the question, why is there such a huge gap between what Arizonans say they want and what we're getting? I think certainly the most recent election and probably longer, this partisanship and focus on issues that really don't rise to the level of majority support, get all the attention and take all the air out of the room relative to important issues. And so, we're committed to achieving the Arizona we want, and I really have personally concluded that we're not going to reach the Arizona we want unless we're electing leaders who actually represent the majority of Arizonans. And who represent their hopes and aspirations and fears, and not fears, hopes and aspirations. And I think, the question we're asking is our system designed to do that? And if you look at the data that I shared earlier about the attitude or the outlook of Arizonans on elected leaders, combined with the fact that they do believe the mechanics are overall sound of our elections, then there is a disconnect even there. So what is the answer to that? And I think it is a design question, and I think this is a really interesting, important design discussion.
Well, Catherine, where does the term accountability come from? Because we talked about elected officials want to get reelected. So is there a possibility, or how likely is it, that the accountability changes more to a broader swath of voters wanting things to get done, as opposed to it being to the advantage of whichever party happens to be in power to maybe muck up the works a little bit, because that will feed their base more? In fact, how about this? Can we hear less about red meat preaching to the choir in a system like this?
Yeah, so, can you hear less? There is some discussion over whether a system like this will encourage somewhat more civil campaigning versus just this division. And I think there is something to that, because you're going to have to appeal to a majority of voters. So you can't do a scorched earth campaign, because then you'll get a plurality, but not the majority in most cases. I think that is not the main reason why we would want this, because we don't want people to be nice just for the sake of it, in a sense. We want actually a diverse, dynamic debate of ideas, because these things are worth disagreeing over. They're worth saying, I think this, no, I think this, because that's how we would figure it out. They are complicated. I mean, if our problems were easy at the state or federal level, even our crummy current system would solve them, right? So we have to have this debate, which is the other thing I really like about Final Five voting, because when you have 5 candidates, you're going to get all these different viewpoints. Final Five voting is sometimes thought of as, oh, it's only going to elect the moderate. It's going to elect the squishy middle. And that is definitely not the point. The point is, to let general election voters decide, and if general election voters want a centrist, a majority of them, that's who they can have. But if they want someone who is here or somewhere else on a new dimension, they can elect that person too. And the result of this then is not that we elect the squishy middle, it's that we allow the person who is elected to take action across a range of options, policy options, and not only having, you could only do these things that would be okay with your voters. You could only do these things that would be okay with your voters. Innovation, we want fringes in many ways in this country, right? It's a democracy. We need to respect so very many views. Even we have freedom of speech, even those that are anathema to us. But of course, we want the views that win to represent a majority of us. So we can get all those kind of views if you think, and sometimes it's really valuable. If you look at civil rights, we wouldn't have had that movement if we had taken the squishy middle of the entire national opinion at that point in time. You need people who can lead. So we're getting that combination of leadership, diversity, while still preserving the ability of the person who is elected to be responsive to a broader range when they go to Washington, D.C. or to your state capital.